Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
A great religious revival sparked by a man driven to the edge of despair. An explosion of social unrest and bitter political conflict. Together, they gave old enemies new battle cries and shook Christendom to its very core. The Reformation, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
A lot of history is about kings and queens and battles because for a long time so much of history turned around kings and queens and battles. The whims and personalities of princes and of the great men who served them influenced policies, made wars, made treaties, affected the lives of everybody else. Now, this rule had been suspended during part of the Middle Ages when power had been restricted to a local scale, but as the 15th century turned into 16th, modern monarchs and modern monarchies appeared. They wanted to be all-powerful, and they persuaded their subjects that indeed they were, or at least they should be, all-powerful. Even their guardian angels were considered more important than the angels that guarded people of lesser rank. There was Louis XI of France, who lived in the 15th century, Ferdinand of Spain, who straddled the 15th and 16th centuries, and Henry VIII of England, who was born the year before Columbus sailed and who died in 1547. These were the fathers of the modern state. It would take centuries to be perfected, but from the very beginning, the modern state pursued four major tasks. First, to secure obedience, to neutralize all possible challengers, to gain the monopoly of force, to maintain law and order, to make the violence it exerted the only legitimate violence. And what this meant, you can see in the gibbets that figure prominently in a lot of paintings. The second thing the state had to achieve was to exert control over economic life, to facilitate the circulation and exchange of goods, to grasp as much as possible of national income. Third, it had to refocus patriotic identity from the local to the national scale. Here we see not only Henry III of France, but also the lily, or fleur de lis, which had become the symbol of French royalty. And finally, the state had to dominate or control the religious life of society, or at least ally itself with the representatives of religion. Now, We've already seen that the rise of the modern state was dependent on both the growth of a modern economy of capital and account books like this one, and on the arms that new technology made possible and the new economy made affordable. But it also owed a great deal to the revival of Roman law, which had survived in Italy, and which after the 13th century spread through Europe, carried by lawyers trying to strengthen the king against the clergy and against his feudal vassals. Roman law carried the idea of an absolute ruler, the princeps, whose will was law. This combined with another classical ideal, that of the hero, who is practically a god, strong, benevolent, and wise. This heroic royal figure was going to incarnate what we today describe as nationalism, a sentiment of patriotic pride in origins and in past glories, which would be used to justify present dominion and future greatness. By the 16th century, Italians, Spaniards, and Frenchmen learned to sing the glory of their particular country, to glorify a national character or a national tongue. German humanists compared the German past to that of ancient Rome and inspired this triumphal arch for their king and emperor Maximilian. Shakespeare's plays praised England, disparaged its neighbors, exalted patriotic sentiment. The reference to the past which inspired the present could also focus on the ideal figure of the prince who personified his people and the nation. In theory, the prince answered the need for a strong central authority to impose unity and order. In practice, the material interests of most princes were served by more law and order. More law and order improved revenues. Regular revenues paid for the regular armies that could impose more law and order and squeeze more revenues, thus further increasing the central power. With this increasing centralization of the state, the modern relationship between the central authority and the individual subject and taxpayer began to take shape. So did the representative institutions, the councils, parliaments, estates that mark the modern West and that are all related to taxes. When states and rulers no longer turned for aid to vassals but to all their subjects, they had to win their consent. But popular assemblies composed of all the citizens, as in the ancient Greek cities, were not feasible where the number of people and the distances between them were too great. And so, as a substitute for personal attendance, there developed the concept of representation, the idea that certain men, elected or appointed, could speak for other men or cities or estates. Some of these representative assemblies became instruments of opposition to royal authority, but for the most part, their very existence gave disparate territories a sense of unity they had not had before. Voting taxes and paying them didn't just affect the purses of people, it affected their minds as well. At the same time, the princes needed administrators. In France, whose kings were best served in these matters, there were some 12,000 civil servants in 1505, 1 to about 1,250 people. 400 years later, there would be one for every 70 French men and women, and today there are almost as many state employees as there are citizens to be administered. The princes also needed soldiers to back up their officials and, above all, for war, which was the greatest industry of their time, as it often is of our time. The princes also needed representatives for negotiations, for diplomacy, which is the continuance of war by other means, and which the 15th and 16th centuries were beginning to develop, along with international law, a code that governed relations between sovereigns and between sovereign states. Meanwhile, medieval concepts were disappearing. The Holy See was not even a shadow of what it had once been. The Pope was an Italian prince trading in what merchandise he had: ecclesiastical appointments, dispensations from the application of church law to permit divorce, absolve from adultery or even murder, indulgences which provided remission of sins in return for worthy acts, or better still, in return for payment. As for the emperor, like Sigismund of Hungary here, who was crowned in 1411, he had no power to tax or to impose his will outside his own territories. He was simply the highest bidder in the auction for the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1519, for example, Charles V, King of Spain, was the winner. He had the backing of the great banking houses, especially the Fuggers of Augsburg, who advanced most of the money to buy the electors and the Pope, and who, just as importantly, refused to credit the bank drafts of Charles's competitors. It's from this point on that the power of money or finance capital dominates the world. Financial power created the armies with which the new emperor conquered his enemies and kept his huge empire together. Charles's grandfather, the Emperor Maximilian, had not been able to collect anything like regular taxes, so he hadn't been able to keep up anything like a real standing army. A few kings, like Louis XI in France and Ferdinand of Aragon, had got one. But Charles was the first emperor who managed to do this, and if changed economic conditions played their part, a new business outlook and a business alliance played equally important parts. Charles's son, Philip II, who lived from 1527 to 1598, was not only the King of Spain, but also King of Portugal, which he inherited through his mother. He ruled an empire far greater than that of ancient Rome, an empire that stretched from the Americas to Asia. You have to imagine the scale of this empire in terms of what distance meant in the 16th century. A round trip from Lisbon to Goa in India took 18 months. A trip from Seville in Spain to Lima in Peru took 2 years. And from Seville to Manila in the Philippines, which were named for Philip, of course, it took up to 5 years. You can understand the remark of a Spanish viceroy that if death came from Madrid, we should all live to a very old age. No doubt if death had come, it would have come by written order. Spanish government was government by paper and by the bureaucracy that shuffled the paper. The bureaucrats were trained in universities whose numbers in Spain tripled during the 16th century from 11 to 33, and which were also set up across the Atlantic. The University of Santo Domingo was founded in 1538, the first university in the Americas, 100 years before Harvard College. Others followed in Mexico and Peru. And it was the flow of capital in the form of gold and silver from America that paid for the universities and the bureaucracy, that lubricated the wheels of commerce and fueled the military and political supremacy of Spain through the 16th and the 17th centuries. So Spain's American empire made her European empire possible. The new alliance between capital and the state would be disturbing for a lot of people, as would be the newly important part which money came to play in the life of a society whose members had managed without it, or with very little of it, for a long time. There were waves of speculation, waves of bankruptcies, and these didn't just affect the bankers and the merchants, but also a whole series of dependent industries and enterprises, and of course workers. This was the crucial period when Europe switched from the more or less stable economic plane of the Middle Ages to an economic life that isn't really very different from our own. A life where the value of money fluctuated, unemployment became endemic, cities got overcrowded, and rising prices and lower wages were experienced everywhere. And the result of this was resentment, unrest, revolts in the trading cities, peasant risings in the countryside, and agitation by nobles suffering from inflation. The social dissatisfaction created by this insecurity and unrest was going to come to a head in Germany and the lowlands, and it was going to break out under the banner of a religious idea. On October 31st, 1517, a monk named Martin Luther, who taught theology at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony, nailed on the door of the castle church 95 theses, that is, propositions or arguments against the papal misuse of indulgences and absolution. Now, Luther's gesture was contentious, but it was not revolutionary. Proposing a debate on theological theses was accepted practice. Luther's language was perfectly appropriate for academic debate, and yet the echo of his gesture was going to shake the Western world. Religious war and religious rebellions invariably cut into political conflicts. They provide old enemies with new battle cries. They contribute new and profound causes of friction. Religious conflict ravaged Germany until the 1550s, France and the Netherlands through the second half of the century, and it threw England into political confusion. Within one generation, the seamless robe of Western Christendom was rent. From then on, men stood divided by Christian faith as much as by political allegiance or economic interest. This was the Protestant Reformation. Now, obviously, a religious contest on this scale doesn't break out in an irreligious society. Luther himself is evidence of this. He was driven to the verge of madness by uncertainty and doubt and guilt and the terrible fear that he could never achieve salvation, until he realized that it's not what you do or don't do, it's what's inside you that counts. Your faith in God and in His salvation, His free, forgiving mercy, that are more important than your weakness, your failings, your feeble attempts to atone. The problem that upset Luther, that terrorized him before he found his justification in faith, this passionate anxiety, also upset and frightened a lot of other people and made them listen to Luther when he found a solution to his own problems and offered it as a solution to their problems, a way to achieve salvation, which, as Albrecht Dürer, the painter, put it, opened up new worlds to me. Another evidence of contemporary religious concern is late Gothic art of a flamboyant style that showed off for all to see just how much money and how much art men would invest in the palaces of God. But the age of flamboyant Gothic is also an age of flamboyant piety. This was the time when we begin to get images of the suffering Christ and images of the heart surrounded with thorns, which would be followed by the future cult of the Sacred Heart, and fraternities of the Passion that still survive today in Central and South America and in Spain. There was also the devotion of the Rosary, which is a way of praying and honoring the Virgin by reciting 150 Hail Marys, and a whole host of other practices glorifying the Lady who appeared more and more like the channel of the grace her divine Son provided for men. And from the Virgin, one moved back to her mother, St. Anne, whose great vogue came at the turn of the 15th century and beyond, with the growth of the theory of Immaculate Conception, first of the Virgin, then also of her mother. Even Erasmus wrote that he had been devoured with piety for her since his tenderest youth. This, incidentally, was also a time when many male babies, as well as female, were baptized Anne, such as the French Duke and Marshal Anne de Montmorency. It was also a great time for pilgrimages, with Venice fostering a whole new industry of pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Law courts sometimes sentenced the guilty party to a pilgrimage to one or another sanctuary, where today they would inflict a fine. Along with this, there was an entire cult of relics, various objects from the lives of the saints, even parts of their bodies. At the same time, the Church was printing up indulgences and bringing out hundreds of writings, first for the priests, then for the public, translated from Latin or written directly in French, German, English for the middling bourgeoisie which ignored Latin, and for those pious women who could read. If we look at contemporary art, we can hardly find a Flemish painting without a pious image pinned to the wall. In the 15th and 16th centuries, more and more, God and the saints operate very close to the human plane, and the new naturalism of the artists reflects a growing familiarity or desire for familiarity between the worshipper and the worshipped. This was a period in which the plastic arts provided the imagination with a vision of a very human Christ, and above all, a very humane one, infinitely pitiful and suffering and good, very close to men and women who could recognize their own image on the panels and the paintings which once upon a time bore images of idealized and superior figures. A very human Christ, a very human Virgin Mary, a vast family of saints. Altogether, then, there was no sense in the 15th and 16th centuries that the springs of faith were drying up. There was no loss of interest in religion, no hostility to the old practices. On the contrary, the impression one gets is of a lot of piety and a great appetite for the divine with a great variety of expression. And yet, as far as one can tell, there was also a sense of unease, a discomfort, a certain vague aspiration towards something else. And it came from that new class that had been moving up, not only in riches, but also in influence and status. And these were the people who manufactured and traded and practiced law in the growing urban centers, the city burghers whom we now describe as the bourgeoisie. In our next program, we shall see how their concerns and their interests were going to shake the Western world. Until then.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.